to the podcast, "'Tis But a Scratch, Fact and Fiction About the Middle Ages." I'm your host, Professor Richard Abels. The illness of Pope Francis and the movie Conclave got me thinking about what the Pope is and what the Pope was in the Middle Ages. So over the next 3 episodes, we'll be exploring the evolution of the institution of the papacy from late antiquity through the pontificate of Innocent III and the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, which many have seen as the apex of the power and authority of the medieval papacy, although we're going to question that a bit. In doing this, we will also be exploring the development of the medieval Roman Catholic Church into what historians have termed the Papal Monarchy. With apologies to my wonderful colleagues and friends who have served as co-hosts for this podcast, my co-host for this series is my very favorite one. That, of course, is my partner for life and my inspiration for all things medieval, my wife, Ellen.
Hello.
Elle, you were brought up Catholic. I know that your grandmother, Carol, was a devout Irish Catholic who went to Mass every day. If she were here now, and I asked her who and what the Pope is, how would she have answered?
She'd have been surprised by the question. I mean, the Pope just is. The papacy is unchanging and eternal and absolutely authoritative.
I don't think that all American Catholics today, whether politically on the right or politically on the left, would be so deferential.
As my grandmother, who died in the 1950s, would have agreed, there is a name for Catholics who reject the primacy of the Pope on doctrinal matters.
Let me guess. Protestants.
That's a good one.
Yeah. I remember many years ago when you were a senior at Barnard talking with one of your friends about the Pope's ban on birth control. She indignantly asked me, who does he think he is? And I, being a wise ass, replied, the Bishop of Rome and St. Peter's successor, the Vicar of Christ and keeper of the keys of God's kingdom, whose interpretation of church dogma is infallible. That, at least, is who Pope Paul VI thinks he is.
You did like the idea of a Jew lecturing a Catholic about church doctrine, but as a medieval historian, you probably know more about church doctrine than most practicing Catholics.
Maybe doctrine, at least medieval doctrine. And what I would say is I know more about medieval Catholicism than most Catholics. In a very literal sense, my knowledge of Christianity is academic.
It really is. I was thinking about that when you told me that we would be doing a series on the development of the Catholic Church into a papal monarchy. When you've dealt with medieval religion in the podcast, you've had a tendency to talk about theological doctrines and institutional developments. That's not how either of my grandmothers thought about their religion. Both of my grandmothers were devout Catholics who venerated and respected the Pope. They believed in the church dogma as expressed in the Catechism, but more importantly, they lived Catholicism. It was going to Mass every morning. It was the practice of the Catholic faith and membership in a universal church and in their own particular congregation that defined the church for them, which is very different than an academic approach.
I agree. That's a point really well taken. Academic study of the medieval church has tended to focus on institutions and theology. And the religious devotions of monks and the secular clergy have received a lot more attention than the religious lives of the laity. That, I think, is explained in large measure by the nature of our sources for the Middle Ages. But, to be fair, there have been a number of academic historians, especially since the 1970s, who have taken a cultural anthropological approach to the study of medieval Christianity. Eamon Duffy's The Stripping of the Altars, for example, explores the role played by Catholicism in the lives of the laity in England on the eve of the Reformation. And although I disagree with his skepticism about the existence of a Catholic Church, and obviously Ellen does also, nonetheless, Mark Gregory Pegg's The Corruption of Angels, the Great Inquisition of 1245 to 1246, shows how a medieval inquisitorial register can serve as a window onto the religious beliefs and practices of lay men and lay women. I really enjoy that approach, and the article that Ellen and I co-authored about Cathar women at least touched on how the culture and society of Languedoc shaped the religious experiences of those women who joined the sect. But Ellen is right. Her grandmothers would probably be puzzled and perhaps even disapproving of the approach I'll be taking in this series. So let me begin with a caveat. In this series, Ellen and I will be talking about the papacy and the medieval Roman Catholic Church as institutions. We'll be focusing on the evolving role played by the Bishop of Rome in the development of that church and how that role was influenced by the papacy's interactions with emperors and with kings. In good medieval fashion, I'll begin with an authoritative statement of who and what the Pope is. The Catechism of the Catholic Church. Quote, "The Roman Pontiff is the perpetual and visible source and foundation of the unity both of the bishops and of the whole company of the faithful, who by reason of his office as Vicar of Christ and as pastor of the entire Church has full, supreme, and universal power over the whole Church, a power which he can always exercise unhindered." End quote. In terms of Catholic faith, this was true from the very beginning of the papacy. In terms of history, however, it is the end product of a centuries-long evolution of the papacy. The popes of the early Middle Ages were primarily the local bishops of Rome. True, there was a claim to be St. Peter's successor and to primacy over the Holy Apostolic Church, which in the early Middle Ages was more of a conception than an institutional reality. Even their use of the term pope was not exclusive.
It means father, right?
Yeah. Pope derives from the Greek word papus and the Latin word papa. Both of those terms are affectionate diminutives for father. They're really very much like papa in English. It was applied to the bishops and priests in the first centuries of Christianity as an expression of affection.
Not really surprising, given that the early church modeled itself on an extended family. And even today, priests are addressed by the laity as Reverend Father as a title of respect.
Yeah.
When did Pope become the title of the Bishop of Rome?
Oddly, the first bishop to use Pope, or more precisely Papus, as a title was not a bishop of Rome, but a bishop of Alexandria. That was Heraclius, Patriarch of Alexandria, who held that see from 232 to 248. All of his successors in Alexandria continued to use that title. In the West, the title Pope became associated with the Bishop of Rome in the late 4th century, and in practice was restricted to the Roman Pontiff only from the 9th century on, although it wasn't until 1073 that Pope Gregory VII explicitly prohibited any other bishop from using it. In theory, the Bishop of Rome was the primate of the one Holy Apostolic Catholic Church, and he was also its Reverend Father.
Catholic meaning universal, all-embracing.
And because the city of Rome's prestige as having been the capital of the Roman Empire, its bishop held a special place within the late Roman Empire and its successor in the West, the Carolingian Empire. But in practice, the Bishop of Rome in the early Middle Ages differed little from the other metropolitans.
Okay, but sorry to interrupt, but metropolitan is not a common term.
Yeah. A metropolitan is the term that is used for an archbishop who oversees an ecclesiastical province composed of neighboring dioceses. The bishops of those dioceses are called his suffragans. A metropolitan had and has the power of convoking provincial church councils of his suffragan bishops. Basically, it's pretty much the same thing as an archbishop. The reason why it was called metropolitan is because it was the term that was given in the late Roman Empire to bishops whose sees were the capital cities of the different provinces. That's why it was
Metropolis. Okay.
Metropolis. But maybe I should have a short glossary in the show notes.
Yeah.
As I was saying, the early medieval church in the West was, in theory, a single church. In practice, it was an amalgamation of largely independent bishoprics and monasteries. Religious practice and liturgies differed according to custom from region to region. And Christianity was riven by numerous, long-lasting, and often violent disputes over Christology. That is, over the nature and person of Jesus and his position within the Trinity. Only in retrospect is it clear which of those conflicting views would prevail to become dogma in the Catholic Church and which would be anathematized as heretical. By the end of the 12th century, however, the papacy had become the undisputed head of Western Christianity, a now hierarchical and institutional Roman Catholic Church had evolved into what historians term the Papal Monarchy. And we'll see that in the third episode of this series. Today, we're going to explore approximately the first 7 centuries of the papacy. And as we're going to see over the 3 episodes, the development of the papacy was not linear.
What exactly do we actually know about the popes of the first couple centuries of Christianity, and what sources do we have?
We don't know all that much, to be perfectly honest. Pretty much our sole source of information is the so-called Liber Pontificalis, the Book of Pontiffs, a collection of short biographies of the popes compiled over the centuries. The first edition of the Liber Pontificalis ends with the death of Pope Felix IV in 530, which was when it was probably compiled. The anonymous early 6th century author sought to bolster its authority by attributing the first 38 papal biographies to Saint Damasus, Pope from 366 to 384. In support of this, he forged an exchange of letters between Saint Jerome and Damasus, according to which Jerome asked the Pope for information about his predecessors. Damasus's response serves as a preface to the Liber Pontificalis. Raymond Davis, who translated the first 90 lives, characterizes these letters not simply as forgeries, but as very clumsy forgeries.
So the original Liber Pontificalis was a forgery?
It's a pious forgery, and that's a medieval thing. What made it pious is that the forgery was concocted to correct the ravages of time. It was meant as a creative reconstruction of a document or documents that once existed but had been lost. It was not intended to deceive, but to preserve what was believed to be true. Pride of authorship was not a medieval thing. Authority of authorship, however, was. The more authoritative the author, the more authoritative the text. I'm just surprised that the compiler of the Liber Pontificalis was content to make Damasus the author rather than foist it on St. Jerome, although Jerome was believed to be the author for much of the Middle Ages.
Do we know what was the purpose of the Liber Pontificalis?
Professor Rosamund McKittrick, in her recent book, Rome and the Invention of the Papacy, the Liber Pontificalis, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2020, argues that it was written to create a memory and perception of the papacy within the history of the city of Rome itself. The format of serial biographies recalls the Lives of the 12 Caesars by Suetonius and the less well-known Historia Augusta, a late 4th century continuation of Suetonius that takes us from the Emperor Hadrian down to the very obscure Emperor Numerian, who died in 284 AD. McKittrick suggests that these imperial biographies served as a model for the author of the Liber Pontificalis. The first edition of the Liber Pontificalis was compiled during the Ostrogothic Wars of the Emperor Justinian, when political control over Rome was uncertain. That the format of the Liber Pontificalis echoes that of the Historia Augusta, which we know was in circulation at the time and was used by late 5th century authors, may suggest that its purpose was to create a parallel history of the popes to emphasize the continuity of the Roman Church and the papacy's primacy over the Christian Church.
You know, I'm not a big movie fan, but even I know that the movies present the story of early Christianity within the Roman Empire as one of constant and fierce persecution, with heroic Christians secure in their faith being thrown to the lions in the Colosseum in front of cheering crowds. How does the Liber Pontificalis deal with the papacy before Rome became a Christian empire?
In an odd way, not that much different from the movie version. 31 of the first 32 popes in the Liber Pontificalis are labeled as martyrs, though there is virtually no supporting evidence for most of these martyrdoms. You're right that in popular culture, Christians were always being thrown to the lions. We owe that cliche in large part to two late 19th century works, the novel Quo Vadis, A Tale of the Time of Nero by a Polish novelist, Henryk Sienkiewicz, and the play The Sign of the Cross by the British playwright Wilson Barrett. Both were turned into silent films, Quo Vadis twice in 1913 and 1924, and The Sign of the Cross in 1914. They were then subsequently remade into highly successful Hollywood blockbuster films. The Sign of the Cross in 1932, and that was Cecil B. DeMille's second religious epic, and Quo Vadis in 1951, directed by Mervyn LeRoy. For American audiences, at least, the image of Christians huddled in an arena, stalked by hungry lions, owes probably most to that latter film, which was the highest grossing film of 1951, the year of my birth. But the image was so well established by the early 20th century that the British playwright George Bernard Shaw used it in his 1912 play, Androcles and the Lion. In the original story, and that story goes back to the 1st century AD, Androcles was a runaway slave. In Shaw's play, he became a Christian. That play was also made into a movie, and that movie was made in 1952. You're probably not overly surprised that the historical reality is quite different. Movies exaggerate the ferocity of the persecution. Persecutions, at least formal persecutions, were sporadic and, like many things, differed from place to place. Although there was little active official persecution, at least until the middle of the 3rd century, to be a Christian nonetheless was a capital offense. The Roman authorities regarded Christianity as an antisocial and atheistic superstition and an illegal association. In practical terms, however, the official policy during the Pax Romana was don't ask, don't tell.
What evidence do we have for that?
This attitude is perhaps best exemplified by an exchange of letters in the year 111 between Pliny the Younger, who was then governor of Bithynia Pontus, which is a region in modern-day Turkey along the Black Sea, and the Emperor Trajan on how to deal with Christians. Pliny explained to the emperor that he had been virtually flooded with numerous anonymous accusations. He personally questioned those accused of being Christian. He released those willing to offer sacrifices to the emperor and to the gods and to curse the name of Christ, even if they had confessed to having once been Christian. His inquiry turned up no evidence of criminal activity or depraved activities. This is a quotation from the letter. They asserted that the sum and substance of their fault of error had been that they were accustomed to meet on the fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God, and to bind themselves by oath not to some crime, but not to commit fraud, theft, or adultery, nor falsify their trust, nor to refuse or to return a trust when called upon to do so. When this was over, it was their custom to depart and to assemble again to partake of food, but ordinary and innocent food. Even this, they affirmed, they had ceased to do after my edict, by which, in accordance with your instructions, I had forbidden political associations. Accordingly, I judged it all the more necessary to find out what the truth was by torturing 2 female slaves who were called deaconesses. But I discovered nothing else but depraved, excessive superstition, end quote.
He used torture?
Yeah, but only on slaves. Roman law didn't permit the torture of free people.
Okay, but if he found no criminal activity or wrongdoing, why did he still order those who refused to recant to be executed?
Well, he only ordered the execution of non-Roman citizens. Roman citizens were sent to Rome for trial, as St. Paul had been.
Okay, but why execute what he obviously thought to be a bunch of harmless kooks? And why were so many denunciations if Christians weren't hurting anybody?
I'll tackle the second question first. Once the religion was outlawed, Christians acquired a really bad reputation among their pagan neighbors. Partly this was due to the secrecy surrounding the rites of the Christian sect. Rumors were circulating about wicked Christian practices, and we know about these rumors from anti-Christian polemics that had been included in the works of defenders of the Christian faith who were answering those polemics. So Christians were accused of eating infants during the Mass, of incest, of free love, of disrespect for paternal authority, for refusal to fulfill their civic duties, for lack of patriotism, for pacifism, and for atheism.
Now, I could sort of see how eating infants could be a misunderstanding of the Mass, and the free love and incest part maybe had something to do with misunderstanding the admonition to love one's brothers and sisters. But how did atheism and lack of patriotism get in there?
Well, the charge of atheism came from Christian denial of the existence of other gods. The charge they lacked patriotism came from their refusal to offer sacrifices to the gods of Rome and to offer sacrifices for the welfare of the emperor and the empire.
This reminds me of the Jehovah's Witnesses who were imprisoned in World War II because they wouldn't recite the Pledge of Allegiance since they owed allegiance only to God.
Yeah, it is reminiscent of that. I would emphasize how serious this was for the Romans. The Romans were a religious people, and they believed that the welfare, the very defense and safety of the empire depended upon divine favor, and that divine favor depended upon sacrifices to the gods, sacrifices which the Christians refused to make. Christians' denial of the existence of other gods clashed with one of the fundamental political institutions of the empire, the imperial cult. Beginning with Julius Caesar, successful rulers of Rome were deified upon death. 11 of the first 18 emperors, beginning with Augustus, were recognized as gods by vote of the Senate. This was known as apotheosis. I suspect that not all Romans took apotheosis completely seriously. The down-to-earth Emperor Vespasian supposedly quipped as he lay dying, "Why, puto deus fio? Oh dear, I think I'm becoming a god." But deified emperors had temples erected for their worship and received sacrifices like any other god in the Roman pantheon. While alive, an emperor would not be worshipped as a god, but his genius, his genius, his divine nature or guardian spirit would. Religion and patriotism were inextricably connected in the Roman Empire, which was a problem for Christians who could not accept that an emperor could become a god. You might ask at this point, what about the Jews? They were also monotheists. That's true. But the Jews enjoyed a special status, a special religious status. Theirs was what the Romans termed a religio licita, a legally approved religion. This began with Julius Caesar and was continued by his successors. The Romans respected ancient traditions and the gods and religious practices of foreign peoples, which is possible if your own religion is polytheistic. Although the Romans found Jewish religious practices strange and barbaric, they allowed their Jewish subjects to continue those practices. Of course, they expected in return that the Jews would pray and sacrifice to their strange god on behalf of Rome and its emperor. As long as the Romans thought the Christians were a Jewish sect, they enjoyed the same legal protection. But when the Roman authorities realized that Christians were not the same thing as Jews, and that might have occurred under the Emperor Domitian at the end of the 1st century, Christianity lost the status of a religio licita and became, in the eyes of the Roman authorities, an unauthorized foreign cult and superstition. But the hostility that Christians experienced from their pagan neighbors, and most of the violence against them was perpetrated by those neighbors, had less to do with their questionable devotion to Rome and the emperor than with their perceived transgressions of accepted cultural norms. During the Pax Romana, family and religion were at the center of daily life, and Christians were seen as violating both. They refused to participate in pagan festivals and rituals alongside their families. They placed devotion to their God and to those whom they called their brothers and sisters in Christ above familial duty and the obedience that they owed to their fathers. Because they were an outlawed sect, they congregated in secret, which led to terrible rumors about the debased rites that they practiced. And as a result, they were viewed by their pagan neighbors as fanatical adherents of an alien cult that taught them to despise both religious and filial piety. In short, they were seen as bad sons, bad daughters, bad citizens, enemies of the gods, and secret criminals.
Actually, that's interesting, but Pliny discovered that they weren't criminals and he still ordered them executed?
As he told Trajan, he had them executed not because of any crimes they had committed, but because of their dangerous, and I quote, stubbornness and inflexible obstinacy. Pliny, who was new to being a governor, was unsure about exactly whether he had done the right thing. He had no familiarity with Christians before he got to Bithynia. He just knew that Roman law required them to be executed, but he wanted to get some confirmation that he had done the right thing from Trajan, so he asked Trajan whether simply being Christian was sufficient cause for capital punishment. And this is what Trajan wrote to him, quote, "These people must not be hunted out. If they are brought before you and charges levied against them are proved, they must be punished. But in the case of anyone who denies that he is a Christian and makes it clear that he is not by offering prayers to our gods, he is to be pardoned as a result of his repentance, however suspect his past conduct may be."
Okay. Don't ask, don't tell.
Yeah, don't ask, don't tell. But Trajan also added, and again I quote, "But anonymous posted accusations ought to have no place in any prosecution, for this is both a dangerous kind of precedent and out of keeping with the spirit of our age." I love that spirit of our age.
Me too. Trajan's admonition to ignore anonymous accusations is in line with the ideal that the Pax Romana was supposed to be an age of law and reason.
I'm actually most struck by is that neither Trajan nor Pliny were all that eager to root out Christians. As long as they remained out of sight, Christians weren't regarded as a threat. Their obstinacy was a concern for a Roman governor always on the lookout for possible rebels. But as you said, Pliny seems to have regarded Christians as essentially harmless, superstitious kooks, obstinate kooks, but just that.
There really were persecutions, though.
Yeah, there were. As I said, throughout the Pax Romana, there were sporadic local persecutions in the provinces, but the era of imperial benign neglect ended in the middle of the 3rd century.
I suspect that had something to do with the 3rd century crisis of the empire, when Rome was suffering from plague, economic decline, and incessant civil wars.
It was. And it's part of a worldview that was pervasive in the period. If things are falling apart, if society is falling apart, one looks to placate the gods who must be angry at us for something. Although Christians were the main victims of the 3 imperial persecutions launched by the emperors Decius between 250 and 251, Valerian between 257 and 260, and Diocletian between 303 and 311, they were in a sense collateral damage. The edicts of these emperors were directed toward reviving traditional Roman piety and patriotism and restoring the favor of the gods. Each edict ordered essentially the same thing. Everyone who lived in the empire was to offer a sacrifice and burn incense to the gods on behalf of the welfare of Rome and of the emperor. As Roman administration was highly bureaucratic, this was to be done in the presence of a Roman magistrate who, upon completion of the sacrifice, was to issue a certificate of compliance. Jews were exempted from the requirement, although they were expected to offer a sacrifice to their ancestral god on behalf of Rome and the emperor. Those who failed to comply risked execution. The edicts were not directed specifically against Christians, but it was largely Christians who refused to obey. By the mid-3rd century, Christians may have accounted for as much as 10% of the empire's population. We have no data on how many Christians were actually killed in these three imperial persecutions. That many chose to apostatize rather than suffer martyrdom is evidenced by a long-lasting and bitter schism in the church between those who refused to readmit lapsed Christians into communion and those who offered them absolution. We do know that 4 popes suffered martyrdom during these persecutions. And that brings us back, finally, to the early papacy and the Liber Pontificalis. I'm sorry for the digression. I got a bit carried away. Okay. A second revised edition, which is the one that has come down to us, was produced soon after the first. The continuator revised several of the lives. The 2 compilers apparently were on opposing sides of a couple of papal elections, and he added the lives of 4 more popes, breaking off in the middle of the pontificate of Pope Silverius. The continuator regarded that pope as an unworthy and illegitimate pontiff. That life begins with Silverius bribing the Ostrogothic ruler of Rome, Theodahad, to compel the clergy of Rome to elect him pope. Theodahad makes the electors an offer that they can't refuse. The life then changes direction and describes how the Byzantine general Belisarius defended the city of Rome against the Ostrogothic king Vidigus in the year 536. Apparently, the continuator stopped writing while that siege was still ongoing. A second continuator picked up the work about 100 years later. Curiously, in completing the life of Silverius, he transformed the continuator's Simoniac pope into a holy martyr without bothering to revise the first half of the life. The second continuator's version of Silverius's life probably explains why he is venerated as a saint by both the Roman and Eastern Orthodox churches. After that, the lives seem to have been composed soon after the election of the deceased pope's successor, with varying degrees of detail down to the pontificate of Adrian II, who was pope from 867 to 872. The Liber Pontificalis was then abandoned until it was revived once more in the 12th century. All the anonymous authors seem to have been Roman clerics in the papal bureaucracy. The details in the life suggest that they worked in the papal archives. They clearly wrote to glorify the papacy and the Church of Rome, though the authors' individual prejudices become evident when they write about disputed papal elections, which were surprisingly frequent in the early church.
What does each biography of the early popes in this first edition of the Liber Pontificalis contain?
Well, what they have is the birth names of the pope and the name of his father, his place of birth, what positions he held before his elevation, the length of his pontificate, the Roman emperors during his pontificate, and major theological pronouncements and decrees, administrative innovations, building campaigns of Roman churches, ordinations that he made, the date of his death, the place of his burial, and the duration of the ensuing sede vacante, the vacancy of the papal see. Some also contain historical notes of dubious accuracy.
Oh, fun. Can you give an example?
Yeah, I can. Sylvester I, Saint Sylvester, the pope who baptized the Emperor Constantine the Great. It's one of the longer bios, as it includes a long list of all the churches that Constantine built and adorned. I'm just going to read the beginning of the entry. So here goes. Sylvester, born in Rome, son of Rufinus, held the see 23 years, 10 months, 11 days. He was bishop in the time of Constantine and Volusianus. Because of Constantine's persecution, he sought safety in exile on Monte Sorate. And Monte Sorate is a hill range about 28 to 30 miles north of Rome. Afterwards, he returned in glory and baptized the Emperor Constantine, whom the Lord cured from leprosy through baptism, and from whose persecution he is known to have previously fled into exile. He built a church in Rome on the estate of one of his priests named Equitius, close to Domitian's baths, and established it as a Roman titulus. Even today, it is still called the titulus of Equitius. There he also assigned these gifts, and then you have a long list of gifts that he gave to that church. He issued a decree concerning the whole church. In his time, a council was held on his order at Nicaea in Bithynia, and 318 Catholic bishops gathered, and 208 others whose signatures were circulated were indisposed. They expounded the entire Holy Catholic unsullied faith and condemned Arius, Photinus, Sabellius, and their followers. On the emperor's advice, he gathered in Rome 277 bishops and repeated the condemnation of Callistus, Arius, Photinus, and Sabellius, and he decreed that a priest should not reconcile an Arian who had a change of mind, but only the bishop of the designated place should do so, and that chrism should be consecrated by the bishops, and as a privilege for bishops, that he should confirm one already baptized at the urging of heretics. He also decreed that a priest should mark the chrism on one baptized when he is lifted up from the water because of the risk of death occurring. He decreed that no layman should presume to indict a cleric for a crime. He decreed that deacons should wear dalmatics in church, and their left arms should be covered with pallia, half wool, half linen. He decreed that no cleric should enter a court for any case, nor should he plead a cause before a robed judge except in church. He decreed that the sacrifice of the altar should not be celebrated in silk or in dyed cloth, but only in naturally produced linen, just as the body of our Lord Jesus Christ was buried in a fine linen shroud. He decreed that if anyone wished to undertake service in the Roman Church or be given preferment, he should be a reader 30 years, an exorcist 30 days, an acolyte 5 years, a subdeacon 5 years, a guardian of the martyrs 5 years, a deacon 7 years, a priest 3 years. In this way, being shown to have good testimony borne to him at every stage, even from outsiders, and being the husband of one's wife, and the wife blessed by a sacerdoce, before he should stand for the order of the episcopate.
Wait a minute. He should have only one wife? He expected that candidates for the episcopate would be married priests?
He did. But even at the time, it was a low bar for eligibility. Sylvester might have been expected to require a would-be bishop to have at least lived apart from his wife from the moment of his ordination as priest. This was, in fact, the practice in some ecclesiastical provinces in the early Middle Ages. And clerical celibacy was certainly an ideal promoted by 4th century church fathers, notably by Ambrose and by Jerome. But it wasn't until the mid-11th century that the Roman Catholic Church explicitly required priests to be celibate, and even then the Eastern Orthodox Church continued to allow priests, though not bishops, to marry and have children. Clerical celibacy was one of the issues debated at the Council of Nicaea in 325, but without resolution. That's not surprising, given how common married clergy were at the time. Pope Damasus, for example, was the son of a priest. The same was true for 3 5th-century popes, Boniface I, Felix III, and Anastasius II. And the 6th-century Pope Silverius went one better, as he was the illegitimate son of Pope Hormidas. He continues, "None should intrude into a higher place or the place of his senior, except by acquaintance with these times in order and with modesty, by the expressed consent of all the clerics, and with no cleric and none of the faithful making any objection." He performed ordination of priests and deacons 6 times in December, 42 priests, 27 deacons on various occasions in Rome, for various places, 65 bishops. And that is followed by that very long list of Constantine's basilicas and gifts to the church.
I hadn't heard the story that Pope Sylvester cured Constantine of leprosy by baptizing him. I always thought Constantine was baptized on his deathbed.
And you thought right. Constantine really was baptized on his deathbed. We have that on the authority of Eusebius of Caesarea's contemporary life of Constantine. And it wasn't Pope Sylvester, but Bishop Eusebius of Nicomedia who performed the rite. What made that embarrassing was that Eusebius was an Arian bishop. As I said, the Liber Pontificalis sometimes gets some basic details, historical facts, wrong.
Wait a minute. Constantine was baptized on his deathbed by an Arian bishop? After he presided over the Council of Nicaea that pronounced Arianism a heresy? Well, I guess if you're on your deathbed, you don't exactly get to pick and choose.
Yeah, you're right. I guess that didn't make much of a difference to the dying Constantine, but it did make a great deal of difference to the early 6th century author of the Liber Pontificalis. And that story about Constantine having been cured of leprosy through baptism, that's completely apocryphal. And before you ask, no, he didn't invent the legend. That story was already circulating in the early 5th century. I can appreciate why it was concocted and believed. For one thing, it removed an embarrassing taint from the baptism of the first Christian Roman emperor. That it made Pope Sylvester, and by extension the papacy, central to Constantine's conversion would have made the story irresistible to the author of the Liber Pontificalis. And it also offers a more traditionally Christian, if less Roman, explanation for Constantine's conversion than Eusebius's version.
You mean the story that when the then pagan Constantine was marching to meet his rival and co-emperor Maxentius in battle at the Milvian Bridge, he looked up at the sun
and burnt his retinas to a crisp.
Oh.
Sorry, couldn't resist, just ignore me.
And saw a cross of light above the sun and the words, "In this sign you will conquer." The next night he had a dream that explained the vision.
Just in case he missed the point, which he had.
And was told to inscribe the sign on the shields of his men.
It's not surprising that Eusebius' story is missing from the Liber Pontificalis. After all, Pope Sylvester plays no role in it. But there is something else missing that is much more critical to the history of the papacy.
And that is?
The donation of Constantine, the mid-8th century forgery made in the papal writing office that purports to be an imperial edict issued by Constantine on behalf of Pope Sylvester as Constantine prepared to depart to the east to found his new capital, Constantinople. In it, Constantine, quote, relinquishes by his inviolable gift to Pope Sylvester and to the pontiff's successors the power and sway over the city of Rome and all the provinces, districts, and cities of Italy and of the western regions.
Another pious forgery, right?
And one that was to have a very long afterlife. And interestingly, the story of Sylvester I curing Constantine of leprosy through baptism appears in the donation of Constantine.
If Pope Sylvester had really cured Constantine of leprosy through baptism, I can see why Constantine would be so grateful as to endow the Pope.
And endow also his successors.
And his successors with power and sway over the Roman Empire.
I'll probably be saying this a few times, but one has to remember that the ethos of reciprocity was ingrained in both late Roman and in medieval cultures. Friendships were created and confirmed by gifts, and every gift required a countergift. The Latin expression for this is do ut des. I give so that you will give.
But Pope Sylvester wasn't really the lord and master of the Western Roman Empire. What power and authority did popes in the early Middle Ages actually enjoy?
It varied from pope to pope, and it changed over time. The sources for the early Christian church are really spotty. There is enough evidence to show that the Bishop of Rome, or perhaps more accurately, the Church of Rome, enjoyed a special dignity derived in part because of its association with not one but the two most prominent apostles, St. Peter, the city's first bishop, and St. Paul, who suffered martyrdom there. We have letters from other bishops to early popes asking their opinion on doctrine. It also helped that the Church of Rome was wealthier and, in between persecutions, better connected than provincial bishoprics. At the beginning of Emperor Decius's persecution in 250 AD, the Church of Rome had 46 elders, 7 deacons, 7 subdeacons, and about 100 lesser clergy. It gave poor relief to 1,500 lay people, many of whom were widows. The total congregation has been estimated to have maybe been as many as 50,000. Popes couldn't take a low profile in periods of persecution. And it says a lot that every pope during the reigns of Nero, Decius, Valerian, and Diocletian suffered martyrdom.
Wow. Okay. Now, but you said that the primacy of the Bishop of Rome was generally acknowledged by other bishops. What is the evidence for this, and what did that acknowledgement actually mean?
Okay. Like so much else about Christianity prior to the conversion of the Emperor Constantine in 312, the evidence for the status of the early papacy within the then still forming church is slight. The earliest is the one surviving letter of the fourth pope, St. Clement's epistle to the Corinthians, dated to either 95 or 96 AD. The Church of Corinth at that time was riven with schism. Its deacons had deposed their superiors, whom Clement confusingly identified sometimes as bishops and sometimes as presbyters. The deposed clergy appealed to Rome, and Clement responded with this letter, which was carried to Corinth by 3 Roman clerics. In it, Clement admonishes the deacons to submit to the presbyters, accept chastisement, and make repentance. Clement makes clear that the office of bishop derives from Christ and the apostles, and not from the congregation. The letter doesn't make any special claims for the papacy, other than as an apostolic see, but the fact that Clement, as Bishop of Rome, believed he had the authority to intercede in an internal dispute in a distant church is suggestive. In fact, around the year 180, another church father, St. Irenaeus, cited this incident in his treatise Against Heresies in support of his contention that if a dispute of a doctrine arises, it should be submitted for resolution to the bishops of, and I quote, the oldest churches, those in which the apostles lived, to learn from them what is certain and clear about the issue, end quote. And of those apostolic churches, the greatest and oldest one, according to Irenaeus, is, and I quote again, the church known to all, founded and established at Rome by the 2 most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul, end quote.
This shows that the Church of Rome and its bishop were held in high regard, but does it really establish papal primacy? Did other bishops in late antiquity actually submit to papal decrees?
I think that the best evidence for how the papacy was viewed by other popes in the early church comes from the writings of Saint Cyprian, the Bishop of Carthage in the mid-3rd century during the persecutions of both the emperors Decius and Valerian. He went into hiding during the first and suffered martyrdom in the second. Born into a wealthy pagan family, Cyprian studied law and earned a reputation as an accomplished orator. Dissatisfied with what he felt to be a meaningless and dissolute life, he converted to Christianity. In this regard, he's much like St. Augustine. In preparation for baptism, he distributed his worldly goods to the poor and took a vow of chastity. Within 2 years, he had been ordained a priest and was chosen, he said, against his will. Nolo episcopari, I do not want to be made a bishop, is a humility topos that was standard throughout the Middle Ages. You couldn't be worthy of being a bishop if you aspired to being a bishop. Anyway, he was ordained as Bishop of Carthage, and his most significant contribution in church history is probably his theological writings on the unity of the Catholic Church and the position that he took on reconciling apostate Christians who had sacrificed to the gods out of fear of the imperial authorities. He took a middle position between the rigorists who refused communion to the lapsed and those who would readmit them to the church without imposing any canonical penance. Cyprian insisted that only bishops, however, had the authority to readmit lapsed Christians, and that could be done only through confession, authentic repentance, and the performance of penance. In the case of those who had actually sacrificed to pagan idols, reconciliation, according to Cyprian, could only occur on their deathbed. Cyprian also was adamant that baptisms performed by heretical priests and bishops were invalid. The last brought him into conflict with Pope Stephen. Cyprian had been a strong supporter of Stephen's beleaguered predecessor, St. Cornelius. In his treatise on the unity of the Catholic Church, Cyprian wrote that, quote, the see of St. Peter, the primordial church, is the very source of episcopal unity, end quote. But he did not mean by this that the Bishop of Rome was superior to other bishops. For Cyprian, all bishops were equally successors of the apostles. His contemporary, Pope Stephen I, disagreed. The matter came to a head first over Bishop Marcion of Arles' refusal to grant even deathbed reconciliation to lapsed Christians. Marcion's suffragan bishops appealed to Pope Stephen, who chose to do nothing. They then turned to Cyprian, who wrote to the Pope asking him to excommunicate Marcion and replace him as bishop. Stephen again chose to ignore the appeal. More serious was the clash over baptisms conferred by schismatics. Cyprian denied their validity and insisted upon rebaptism of returning schismatics. Stephen accepted their validity and ordered Cyprian to accept their validity. In doing so, he cited Matthew 16 in justification of his authority as Pope to do so.
Okay, the famous Petrine Creed, where Jesus says to Simon Peter, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you let loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven."
Yep, that's it. Well, what I especially liked about this passage is that it's the only joke or pun told by Jesus in the New Testament.
Yeah, because the name Peter means rock.
Yeah, the Greek word Petros means rock. The other name used for Peter in the New Testament is Kephas, which means rock in Aramaic. The two names are used together in the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 42, where Andrew brings his brother Peter to meet Jesus, whom he recognized as Messiah. Quote, Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas," which, when translated, is Peter. End quote.
Oh, apparently Jesus was speaking to him in Aramaic.
Not surprising, given that Jesus' cry of anguish from the cross, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, Lord, O Lord, why have you forsaken me, is Aramaic.
Okay, how did Cyprian respond to Stephen's appeal to the authority of St. Peter?
Not with the deference to apostolic authority that Stephen wanted to elicit. In fact, Cyprian's response was pretty snarky. He called a synod of African bishops to strike back at Stephen's order. He began that synod by congratulating his fellow bishops that, quote, "None of us sets himself up as a bishop of bishops or exercises the powers of a tyrant to force his colleagues into obedience," end quote. Cyprian didn't mention Pope Stephen by name, but then again, he didn't have to. It was pretty obvious. Dispute ended with the death of Stephen, followed soon after by the martyrdom of Cyprian. Both were subsequently canonized. Pope Stephen's more moderate view that baptism performed by priests are valid even if the priest is himself a schismatic or a sinner became orthodoxy. The issue was revived in the 4th century in the wake of the persecution of Christians by Diocletian. Donatus, a North African bishop, took the rigorous position that sacraments administered by an unworthy priest were invalid, and therefore all those either baptized or ordained by priests or bishops who turned over Christian holy books to the authorities to be burnt needed to be rebaptized. The orthodox position is that the validity of the sacrament inheres in the ordination of the celebrant, not the worthiness of that individual's character. The rigorous position became the Donatist heresy, which was alive in North Africa a century later when St. Augustine of Hippo wrote treatises against it.
I can appreciate the confusion within the church that Donatus's position would have created. How can you be sure that the priest who baptized you was really a worthy man?
Which was the hook I used in my classes at the Naval Academy to explain why the Donatist heresy is significant and relevant. I would ask them whether they obeyed the orders of their company officers because they knew them to be good men and women worthy of their respect, or was it because they were their commanding officers? If they learned that a company officer cheated on his or her spouse, would that mean that they could disobey his or her order?
I mean, sure, and suffer the consequences. From what you've told me, the only orders that a sailor or soldier can disobey are those that are illegal.
Yeah, and he or she better be damn certain that the order is illegal. The point is that good order and discipline within the church required believers to accept the validity of sacraments administered by the ordained, and good order and discipline in the military requires obedience to orders given by those higher up in the chain of command.
Okay, but back to the papacy. Cyprian is a more famous saint than Pope Stephen, so how, why, and when did Stephen's view of the papacy as not only the first bishop among equals, but the bishop of bishops win out?
It took a while, and had, I think, more to do with the conversion of a Roman emperor, Constantine the Great, than with the Pope's claim to be St. Peter's successor. Constantine's conversion did more than end the sporadic persecutions. It elevated the status of the Christian episcopacy, and in particular, that of the Bishop of Rome, the see that was the capital city of the empire.
So the Pope became the head of the church in practice with Constantine's conversion.
Not quite. I would say that the true head of the church was the emperor. Constantine, as a Christian, continued to hold the office of Pontifex Maximus, which he now applied to his new religion. In 314, he intervened in a dispute over what would become the Donatist heresy by declaring that, quote, "It is contrary to the divine law that we should overlook such quarrels and contentions, whereby the highest divinity may perhaps be roused not only against the human race, but also against myself, to whose care he has by his celestial will committed the government of all earthly things." End quote. Sometime later, Constantine became aware of a more fundamental theological dispute, and one that as a new convert he must have found deeply disturbing. He discovered that the clergy of his new religion could not agree on who or what Jesus Christ is. The followers of a priest of Alexandria named Arius believed that Christ was created by God, not begotten of God. He had within him as much as the divine essence as a man could possess, but was nonetheless a creature, not God himself. Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria denounced this as making Jesus into a sort of demigod. He argued instead that Christ was begotten of God and was God incarnate, and that he had existed co-eternally with the Father and the Holy Spirit. Constantine, desiring to know what, as a convert, he was supposed to believe, called for a council of bishops to resolve the question.
And that was the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, which gave us the Nicene Creed, which I still remember. Okay, we believe in one God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth and of all things visible and invisible, and in one Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the only begotten, born of the Father before all ages, light of light, true God, begotten, not made, of one substance with the Father, by whom all things were made, who for us men and for our salvation came down from heaven and was incarnate of the Holy Spirit and the Virgin Mary and became man. And he was crucified for us under Pontius Pilate and suffered and was buried. And on the third day he rose again according to the Scriptures, and ascended into heaven, and sits at the right hand of the Father. And he shall come again in glory to judge the living and the dead, and of his kingdom there would be no end.
Stop right there. You're about to recite the formula of the Nicene Creed decreed by the First Council of Constantinople in 381 and ratified at the Council of Chalcedon in 451. The creed from the First Council of Nicaea simply ends with, "and the Holy Spirit."
So, what Catholics have been saying all these years wasn't the Nicene Creed?
It was the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed, which has also changed since you learned it. But I'll talk about that a little bit later. But back to the First Council of Nicaea. Emperor Constantine was the moving force behind it. He called for the council, paid all travel expenses, made an opening statement, and even participated in the debate, though he did not vote, as that was left to the bishops. The bishop who presided, interestingly, was Hosius of Cordoba. Pope Sylvester did not attend in person, but sent 2 priests to represent the See of Rome. Constantine clearly considered himself as emperor, as the head of the Christian church, not unlike his role as Pontifex Maximus of pagan Rome, and was intent on ensuring that the church be unified in organization and dogma. Constantine's successors continued to assert supreme authority over the Christian church. Each of the first 4 ecumenical councils was called by and presided over by Roman emperors to resolve doctrinal disputes within the church. The conversion of Constantine also had a profound effect upon the organization of the church, as Roman sees were based in the capitals of the Roman provinces, and each diocese represented a province.
Okay, let's bring this back to the papacy. What was the position of the Pope in all this?
Evolving. The Council of Nicaea decreed that the bishops of Rome, Antioch, and Alexandria should have primacy over lesser dioceses. Of the 3, Rome claimed primacy, not on the basis of its affiliation with St. Peter, but as the imperial capital. Two things mitigated against this. First was Constantine's decision to move his capital to Byzantium and rebuild that Greek city as Constantinople. The second was the continuing Arian controversy. Constantine's son and heir, Constantius II, was sympathetic to the Arian position. Urged on by his Arian theological advisors, he demanded the excommunication of Bishop Athanasius and a rejection of the Nicene Creed. This put him at odds with Pope Julius I and his successor, Pope Liberius. The former was protected by Constantius' brother and co-emperor in the West, Constans, but when he died, Constantius became sole emperor. Pope Liberius had no protector against the emperor. At first he refused to abjure the Nicene Creed and agreed to Athanasius' excommunication, but after a stint in exile in Thrace during which the emperor replaced him with another pope, he humbly acquiesced. Popular unrest in Rome with the new pope, Felix, led Constantius II to return Liberius to Rome under the condition that he and Felix rule jointly. Liberius agreed, but the people of Rome rose up and drove Felix out of the city. While Liberius occupied the Lateran papal palace in Rome, Felix resided in the suburbs but retained the title of bishop. From 357 to 365, Rome had 2 popes.
That's embarrassing.
It gets worse. 52 of the first 54 popes are recognized today as saints by the Catholic Church. Liberius is one of the 2 who isn't, because he gave in to Constantius II's demands and renounced the Nicene faith. Felix, on the other hand...
Wait a minute. Wasn't Felix the Arian supporter whom Constantius II elevated to the papacy when Liberius proved obstinate?
Yes, he was. But Felix was later confused with an early Christian martyr with the same name. As a consequence, Felix II is a sainted anti-pope.
Okay, that's embarrassing.
No argument there. Okay, the status of the Bishop of Rome was again enhanced when the Emperor Theodosius I, Theodosius the Great, made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire.
Didn't Constantine do that?
That's a commonly held misperception. Constantine did not make Christianity the state religion of the Roman Empire. To do that would have been a reckless act for an emperor who had won the throne through a civil war. The best estimates I've seen is that in 313 AD, Christians made up at most 10% of the population and were still regarded with suspicion and hostility by many of their pagan neighbors. It didn't help that the religion appealed to the poor and downtrodden, though we know from the Emperor Valerian's edict against Christians that by the mid-3rd century at least some Christians were of consular rank. Constantine was also well aware that the traditional Roman pantheon was regarded as the protectors of Rome. Although living emperors were not worshipped as divine beings, good Roman citizens were expected, even when not ordered by imperial edict, to sacrifice to the gods for the welfare of Roma et Augustus, for the divine spirits of Rome and the emperor. It was a bold move for Constantine to embrace the religion. I can't see how it benefited him politically, which leads me to accept that his conversion was probably genuine. But Constantine's conversion not only legalized Christianity, but gave the religion the cachet that it had previously lacked. The Liber Pontificalis' life of Sylvester obliquely alludes to Constantine's edicts in favor of Christianity and in particular the clergy. Sylvester could not have on his own authority forbid clergy from bringing suit or answering charges in secular courts. That was possible because Constantine had granted to Christian bishops the privilege of adjudicating lawsuits involving Christians in ecclesiastical courts. To make entering the Christian clergy more appealing, Constantine also decreed that the clergy should be exempt from taxes and from compulsory civic duties. Under Constantine, Christianity became fashionable. If one wanted a place in the imperial court, it was wise to convert to the emperor's religion. What cemented the role of Christianity in the late Roman Empire was that all of Constantine's successors in the 4th and 5th centuries were Christian except for one.
Julian the Apostate.
And he was an apostate because he had been a Christian in his youth and, in fact, had been a church lector before he converted to paganism when he was around 20.
And infuriated the leaders of the Christian church by prohibiting them from persecuting other Christians for heresy.
Some of the leaders of the church regarded that as a much harsher persecution, as it brought with it no opportunity for martyrdom. At any rate, in 380, by imperial edict, Theodosius proclaimed the Christianity of the First Council of Nicaea to be the official state religion of Rome.
And what did that entail?
I'll let the Edict of Thessalonica speak for itself. Quote, "It is our desire that all the various nations which are subject to our clemency and moderation should continue to profess that religion which was delivered to the Romans by the divine apostle Peter, as it has been preserved by faithful tradition, and which is now professed by the Pontiff Damasus and by Peter, Bishop of Alexandria, man of apostolic holiness. According to the apostolic teaching and the doctrine of the gospel, let us believe in the one deity of the Father and of the Son of the Holy Spirit in equal majesty and in a holy Trinity. We order the followers of this law to embrace the name of Catholic Christians. But as for the others, since in our judgment they are foolish madmen, we decree that they shall be branded with the ignominious name of heretics, and shall not presume to give to their conventicles the name of churches. They will suffer in the first place the chastisement of the divine condemnation, and in the second the punishment of our authority, which in accordance with the will of heaven we shall decide to inflict."
That doesn't sound like it was directed against pagans, but against other Christians.
It was. It wasn't until 391 that Theodosius took action against pagan worship, closing all pagan temples and outlawing pagan worship. In 380, Theodosius, who was an ardent adherent of Nicene Creed Christianity, saw the Arians as a much greater threat. Unlike his predecessors, he used his power as emperor to suppress what he considered to be heterodox or heretical Christian worship. This was a formidable job, as most of the Christian establishments in the East were Arian. But he wasn't shy about using force. He ordered the deposition of Arian bishops and the confiscation of their church property, and replaced them with Nicene bishops. Among those replaced was the Arian bishop of Constantinople. In his place, Theodosius elevated the ardent Nicene theologian Gregory of Nazianzus, who was then recovering from injuries suffered at the hands of a pro-Arian mob in the city. Gregory, after consultation with Pope Damasus, convinced Theodosius to summon an ecumenical council to reaffirm the canons of the Council of Nicaea and pronounce the Arian position as heretical. This was the first council of Constantinople, held in 381. The affirmation of the Nicene Creed was a victory for the papacy, but what was less welcome was the third canon of the council.
What was that?
Quote, "The Bishop of Constantinople, however, shall have the prerogative of honor after the Bishop of Rome, because Constantinople is the new Rome." End quote.
Why was this a problem for the Pope? I mean, it does place the honor of the Bishop of Rome ahead of the Bishop of Constantinople.
Yes, but you have to remember that Constantinople had only become a capital city 50 years earlier. If anyone, the bishops of Alexandria and Antioch ought to have been upset, as the Bishop of Constantinople, who unlike them did not hold an apostolic see, now leapfrogged over them. Initially, popes accepted the formulation, but once Constantinople had been established as the new Rome, it opened the door for the next step, equality with the old Rome. And that is exactly what was decreed in the 28th canon of the Council of Chalcedon in 451. Quote, "The Bishop of New Rome, that is Constantinople, shall enjoy the same privileges as the Bishop of Old Rome on account of the removal of the empire." End quote. The jurisdiction of the Patriarch of Constantinople was widened at the expense of the Patriarch of Alexandria, which lost its authority over the Roman provinces of Asia, Pontus, and Thrace. The Archbishop of Jerusalem was also recognized as having the status of a patriarch. The Council of Chalcedon thus established the organization of the Catholic Church as a pentarchy of patriarchates. The Council of Chalcedon presented a conundrum for Pope Leo I, who along with Pope Gregory I the Great was the most important pope of late antiquity. Leo I was an ardent believer in the Petrine Creed and papal supremacy. He saw himself as the primate over all bishops and confidently exercised his authority over the bishops of Italy. When the Bishop of Arles attempted to make his see a new patriarchate independent of Rome, Leo I sought and received from the Emperor Valentinian III an imperial rescript recognizing papal jurisdiction over all the dioceses of the Western Empire. Leo's claim, however, went beyond that, as he asserted, quote, "The care of the universal church should converge towards Peter's one seat, and nothing anywhere should be separated from its head," end quote. Theologically, Chalcedon was a victory for Pope Leo I. The main reason the council had been called was to resolve another Christological dispute, whether Christ had both a divine or human nature that existed side by side in his person, or whether he had only one nature in which his Godhead had absorbed completely his human nature. The former was recognized as the Orthodox doctrine. The latter became the Monophysite heresy. Pope Leo I's writings against the Monophysites had played a key role in the council. Leo ultimately signed off on the canons of the Council of Chalcedon with one exception, Canon 28, which he rejected on the ground that it violated the sixth canon of the Council of Nicaea, which recognized only the patriarchates of Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch.
And how did that play out?
The so-called Pentarchy was written into law, and I mean that literally. In the year 534, in the Great Comprehensive Roman Law Code issued by Emperor Justinian, the Corpus Juris Civilis, Justinian organized the entire church into 5 patriarchates that had superior jurisdiction over other sees. These were, in order of precedence, Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Justinian's edict on the primacy of Rome is novel 131 of his code, and it reads as follows, quote, "We order that the most holy Pope of ancient Rome shall hold the first rank of all the pontiffs, but the most blessed Archbishop of Constantinople, the New Rome, shall occupy the second place after the Holy Apostolic See of ancient Rome, which shall take precedence over all other sees," end quote.
And how did that play out?
That's not certain. Ecclesiological issues took a back seat to more pressing concerns for popes from the mid-5th century on. With the collapse of central Roman imperial authority in the West in the late 5th and 6th centuries, popes, like other bishops in the West, filled the power vacuum by assuming a greater civil and political role within Rome and its dioceses. Popes like Leo I and Gregory I, both of whom received the title the Great, negotiated with barbarians.
And those barbarian kings were Christians?
Pope Leo I is famous for supposedly persuading Attila the Hun to withdraw from Italy in the year 452, though an outbreak of malaria probably had more to do with it. Attila was a pagan and probably regarded Leo as a Roman official. When Gregory I became pope in the year 590, he had to contend with the invasion of Italy by the Lombards. And the Lombards were Christians, but they were Arian Christians, as were the Visigoths in southern Gaul. Although neither Pope Leo I nor Pope Gregory I exercised actual influence over bishops north of the Alps or beyond the Duchy of Rome, they both jealously defended the claim of the Roman pontiff to primacy against their main rival, the Patriarch of Constantinople. I should emphasize that their rivalry was with the Patriarch and not with the Byzantine Emperor, who for 2 centuries controlled papal elections. The city and the diocese of Rome fell under the jurisdiction of the Byzantine Exarchate of Ravenna from the late 6th century until 752. Every pope between 537 and 752, with one exception, sought confirmation of their election to the Roman see from the Byzantine emperor before they received consecration, and many of these popes were of Greek ethnicity.
Wait a minute. A pope-elect needed to be approved by the Byzantine emperor before being consecrated? The pope was subordinate to the emperor? And what was the theological justification, if any, for all this?
I'm surprised that you're surprised after hearing about the roles played by previous emperors like Constantine and Theodosius in defining the doctrine and the organization of the church. The Byzantine emperors, or as they called themselves, the Roman emperors, the emperors of the Eastern Empire, took matters further. They presented themselves not only as God's vicar on earth, but as the living icons of Christ's majesty as ruler of the universe. Church and state were united in the person of the emperor. This was accepted by the popes of the Byzantine Duchy of Rome.
Okay, but how does this fit in with Byzantine iconoclasm? Was the idea of the emperor as the living icon of Christ rejected?
Great question. But I have to confess, I don't know the answer. I feel like one of my midshipmen. I don't know, sir, but I will find out. But back to the popes. The career of the one pope who didn't see confirmation from Byzantium illuminates the relationship between the papacy and the Byzantine emperor. That pope was Martin I, who held the papacy from 649 to 653. He was an Umbrian who had served as Pope Theodore I's Apocryciarius.
Stop. Apocryciarius?
The term used for the papal legate in the court of the Byzantine emperor. Most popes of this period had previously served in that role, which is why and how the Byzantine emperors knew them and approved of their elevation to the Roman See. Martin I's decision to be consecrated immediately without formal imperial approval pissed off Emperor Constantine II. Unsurprisingly, Constance refused to acknowledge Martin as pope. But Constance had more pressing concerns in 649. The Umayyad Caliphate was in the process of conquering Byzantine territory in Armenia, Asia Minor, and North Africa. But in 655, Constance sent soldiers to Rome to take Pope Martin into custody and bring him back to Constantinople to stand trial for treason. You look surprised. So before you ask, no, he wasn't charged with treason for failure to have asked for imperial confirmation of his election as pope. Martin's treason consisted in his refusal to obey an edict that the emperor had issued in 648 forbidding all discussion and all debate over whether Christ has one or two wills. The Byzantine Empire, as I said, was under serious military threat, and Constance wanted to end a religious dispute that was dividing the empire. The dominant view in the churches of Asia Minor and the Near East was that Christ had a single will. This is the Monothelite heresy. The dominant view in the Western churches, including the papacy, was that Christ has two wills and natures. This became the orthodox theological position.
I think that most of our listeners will find it difficult to believe that mobs of people were fighting each other over something as arcane as whether Jesus has one nature or two natures or wills. It reminds me of Jonathan Swift, Gulliver's Travels, in which Lilliputians are fighting a civil war over whether boiled eggs should be broken at the small end or the large end.
Yeah, Swift's snarky commentary on theological disputes of his age, but we really need to remember that religious toleration as an ideal is the result of the 18th century European Enlightenment. I find it interesting that in today's America, the Christian right is willing to ignore doctrinal differences between the various sects as long as they share in the ideal of a Christian America.
That's a recent thing. Even in my lifetime, many evangelical Christians viewed Catholics as papists and questioned whether they were really Christian. I mean, that is something Samuel Alito should bear in mind.
Amen. But back to our story. The Emperor Constantine's solution to the theological dispute dividing his empire and making it vulnerable to the first Muslim jihad was essentially, don't ask, don't tell. If nobody argued or discussed the matter, it would go away. That satisfied neither side. When Martin continued to attack monothelitism in defiance of the edict, Constance II regarded it as treason. Martin was convicted, sentenced to death, and publicly flogged. The Patriarch asked the emperor for leniency, and the death sentence was commuted to banishment to the Crimea. Despite Martin's appeal to the Roman clergy not to elect a successor, the Roman clergy succumbed to the pressure placed on them by the Exarch of Ravenna and elected a more compliant successor. Martin may have lost the papacy, but he did end up as a martyr and a saint, though not until after the death of Constance's son and the rejection of monothelitism as a heresy.
Okay, I grant that in the 6th and 7th centuries, the papacy's interest beyond Rome and his diocese lay largely with Byzantium. But several popes were also concerned with the conversion of Rome's barbarian successor kingdoms north of the Alps. I mean, Pope Gregory I famously, at least in the English-speaking world, sent St. Augustine of Canterbury to convert the pagan Angles. The close tie between England and the papacy created by his mission lasted throughout the Middle Ages.
That is the mission that he's most famous for, but closer to home, Pope Gregory I also strove to convert the Lombards from Arian to Orthodox Christianity. But here he was probably motivated by practical, political, as well as religious considerations. The Lombards had pushed out the Ostrogoths from northern Italy, and by the late 6th century were a threat to Rome. Gregory I all but begged aid from the Byzantine exarch at Ravenna. The guy's name was Romanus, but was repeatedly denied. It forced a reluctant Gregory to assume a role in the civil administration of the Duchy of Rome, using church funds to relieve a famine in the city, taking control of the city garrison and appointing military commanders to guard the duchy's strongholds, and finally paying off the Lombards, much to the disapproval of both the exarch and the emperor in Constantinople. Gregory's actions were not intended to make the Pope the ruler of the duchy. He undertook them out of desperation in conjunction with his efforts to convert the Lombards. When Romanus died in the year 597 and was replaced with a more amenable exarch, Gregory gratefully left diplomacy in his hands.
And of course, there's one major connection between the papacy and Christian Europe north of the Alps: pilgrimages.
You're absolutely right. In fact, I would contend that the main source of spiritual prestige and authority of the early medieval papacy among ordinary Christians was not its claim to ecclesiastical primacy, but a material reality. The city of Rome was the repository of more holy Christian relics than anywhere else in the West. Rome boasted the tombs of both Saints Peter and Paul. As such, it was a magnet for pilgrims throughout the Middle Ages. The lure of Rome for pilgrims is captured in a late 9th or 10th century pilgrim song, O Roma Nobilis. O noble Rome, mistress of the world, most excellent of all cities, stained red with the ruby blood of martyrs, decorated with the white lilies of virgins, for all we salute you. We bless you, hail you for all ages. Peter, you supreme key giver to the heavens, hear our vows as we pray constantly. When you sit supreme as judge of the 12, be quick to forgive, judge them leniently, as we beg you now at this time to judge us mercifully.
I remember from my classes with Professor Wempel 50 years ago at Barnard that the power of the papacy was greatly enhanced by its partnership with the Carolingians.
And even before that, with the Merovingian kings of the Franks. While the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, and Lombards had all converted to Arian Christianity, the Franks in Gaul, under their first great king, Clovis, had converted to Roman Orthodox Christianity at the end of the 6th century. But you are right. The power and authority of the Pope beyond the Alps were greatly enhanced, at least for a time, by the papacy's partnership with the Carolingians. And that seems like a good place to end this episode.
So we'll pick up with Pepin the Short in our next episode.
And with a partnership between the Carolingians and the papacy that transformed both. Until then, bye for now.